Hey, everybody. My name is Ben Baby. I cover the Cincinnati Bengals for ESPN's NFL Nation. And if you've been following the Bengals through the first four games of the season or are playing fantasy football, you probably realize that one of the Bengals' star players isn't really living up to what people thought he would at this point in the season. And that's running back Joe Mixon. And don't worry, you're not the only ones kind of frustrated by that. Joe Mixon is as well. In fact, yesterday we talked to him in the Bengals locker room, leading into Cincinnati's Week 5 game against Baltimore. And Joe, to his credit, was really candid about talking about the frustrations and why things haven't been going well and what are some things that maybe haven't been clicking for Cincinnati's offense in the running game. And when we talk about Joe not hitting, it's definitely to a big degree. In fact, when you look at most of the major metrics in rushing analytics, Mixon is near the bottom or at the bottom of many of them. He is last in the NFL in yards per carry among guys with at least 30 carries or more, according to ESPN stats and information. An interesting stat that I found is that he is on average around the longest it takes for him to get a yard among running backs, if that makes sense. That's where he sits at about 5.55 yards essentially to get 1 yard. I know that's a very clunky way of describing it, but if you think about it, kind of the quickest point from point A to point B, Mixon's essentially taking the longest way to get to that yard, which can show a little bit of patience, shows that he's trying to find the right maybe hole to hit as he's attacking the line of scrimmage. And when you look at his speed metrics, that definitely kind of plays out a little bit as well. Right now, according to NFL Next Gen, he's averaging about 8.92 miles per hour when he hits the line of scrimmage. Last year, he was around 10.03, according to Next Gen. So I knew I just threw a ton of numbers at you. There's a lot to go into. So we're going to unpack a lot of that bit by bit. Let's start with what happened last week. So we talked to Joe Mixon, like I said, in the locker room, and he pointed out that he called a meeting with the offensive line. Essentially, it was around 10 people, and they wanted to go through and really just get on the same page. And remember, we've talked about that Bengals offensive line. If you've liked and you've subscribed, you know that that's been a topic of discussion through the first 4 weeks of the season, especially as quarterback Joe Burrow was getting sacked a ton. Well, Mixon called that meeting, and they really wanted to go over what everybody was seeing. Maybe there are some things that could be done better by all parties, whether that's maybe an extra block here or there, Mixon not seeing things as well as he probably needs to see them. All of that was discussed, and because of that, Mixon said he felt like that's going to benefit the run game moving forward. And when you talk to Mixon, when you talk to Bengals head coach Zach Taylor, even though the numbers aren't there, there's a lot of optimism that the run game is going to find its way at some point. Everybody says that, it's one block here, one block there. It's just maybe the smallest of margins keeping the Bengals from hitting those big plays. Now, of course, if you're a Bengals fan, you've probably heard a lot of that before. It's been a common refrain with the running game, not hitting as well as maybe the Bengals would have hoped, as well as fantasy managers would have hoped, and definitely as well as Mixon would have hoped over the last several years. What's interesting when you look at Mixon is that last year was his best year in terms of his accolades, was named to the Pro Bowl for the first time in his career in his 5th season in the NFL. But I think a lot of that, when you look at the yardage, he cleared 1,000 yards again, came off the volume that he had. He ranked near the middle of the pack, if not maybe even a little lower than that in terms of yards per carry. And like we said earlier in the video, this year, he's among the worst in the NFL. And usually as the Bengals got ahead in games in the second half last season, they were able to use Mixon on the ground, really create the yards they were looking for to essentially seal the game. And when you look at the offense and the way that teams run the ball in the NFL, that's the ideal way to build those rushing totals and also, make sure that you salt away wins, which definitely aren't easy in this league. But, for whatever reason, it just hasn't all came together. And Mixon pointed out, in 2019, there were a lot of conversations about why things weren't going well. In fact, he had 320 yards in the first 8 games. And what happened was the Bengals were winless. That was the year they finished with the league's worst record that ended up getting them quarterback Joe Burrow. But at the time, there were a lot of questions about that rushing game. So the Bengals on the flight back from London, they played the Los Angeles Rams over there in the UK. On the way back, they essentially ripped up their entire run game. And in the last 8 games, Mixon thrived and even hit 100 yards or 1,000 yards, excuse me, which is a crazy feat. And Mixon brought that up when he talked to us in the locker room the other day. Now, the big difference is in that season, like I just said, they overhauled the entire scheme. This year, they have Frank Pollock, a guy that Mixon was really excited about when the Bengals hired him as their offensive line coach. This is Pollock's second season. They've built a scheme that they feel like should work well around Joe. And I asked Zach Taylor, even with all the optimism, at what point do you maybe look at, tearing everything up? And he very succinctly and sternly told me that they look at all those things. They're constantly analyzing why the run game isn't probably as good as it needs to be. And I think one thing that we definitely should discuss is that, Mixon is in his 6th year, and the shelf life for running backs isn't necessarily all that long in the NFL. And one of the more interesting things when you look at it is Mixon's usage since 2019 to now has been among the highest in the NFL. He ranks near the top 5 in total carries among all running backs during that span. And this season, he's already near the top among carries among running backs in the NFL, and he's projected to clear the 300 carry total for the entire season, which would be his career high. And mind you, he just had his career high last year as well. So Mixon has gotten the ball a ton in this offense. And another guy who has also had a high volume of carries, also been really productive over the last few years, it's Tennessee's Derrick Henry. He also hasn't been performing up to what many people believe. Now, there's also a lot of different dynamics. It's Tennessee's offense, Cincinnati's offense, 2 completely different things, especially when you look at the passing game and how, defenses have to game plan for stopping each of those respective offenses. So not necessarily an apples to apples comparison, but it also kind of underscores that, there are always, anytime you have a lot of carries and a guy's got a lot of wear and tear on his body, you're wondering how much longer can he perform at an elite level. And the Bengals, in 2020 gave Mixon a contract extension that at the time, I think even now is aged pretty well. You can have the debate on whether you want to pay running backs or not, but at, essentially 4 years and 12 million a year, and an extension to his rookie contract. I think when you look at it, that's a very, healthy amount. I think that's a good amount for both sides. And so that will run, I believe, until the end of 2024, if I'm not mistaken. And so there are still some time left for the Bengals to basically get the most out of this contract with Mixon. And Mixon obviously is looking to get that production. And he talked about that. He said that, he is a little bit frustrated that those numbers aren't there. Obviously, he called a meeting with the rest of his teammates, with the guys who are blocking with him up front. He pointed out that, the offensive line, assistant coach Frank Pollock, who we talked about earlier, running backs coach Justin Hill, everybody's on the same page and has the same goal. And ultimately, as long as the team is winning, Mixon is going to be satisfied. And he is getting the ball in the passing game. So that has been a good sign for fantasy managers, especially if you're in a PPR league, you're at least getting some sort of production from Mixon. But all in all, there's definitely no mistake about it. The Bengals have to be better on the ground, especially when you look at the type of defenses that Cincinnati is facing when they're playing a lot of, 2 high safeties or cover 2 up top, and they're daring Joe to run the ball. It's not working out well. And the numbers are really staggering, especially when you talk about those light boxes. Mixon has the worst rushing yards over expectation among all running backs in the NFL against light boxes. So let me break that down for you. So whenever the defense has essentially 7 or fewer, I think it might even be 6 or fewer defenders in the box, essentially it's a good scenario, the matchup. You've got more blockers than defenders in the near the line of scrimmage. It's a situation that's conducive to good rushing attacks. There are only 3 running backs who have negative rushing yards over expectation, which means that the next gen models, they have the running backs rushing for fewer yards than what they were projected to get on those plays. So that takes blocking into account, how big the spaces are at the line of scrimmage. All of that are taken into consideration. The only guys who are negative, I'm gonna make sure I get this right here. We got Dalvin Cook, Miles Sanders, and Joe Mixon. But the difference between Mixon, Cook, and Sanders is that Mixon is at negative 42 rush yards over expectation. So essentially 42 under. That's got to be a very concerning stat if you're the Bengals. That's one that they definitely need to figure out over these next few weeks as the Bengals, now starting with week 5, face Baltimore for the first time, probably going to be their biggest rival in terms of defending that AFC North title. And, the Bengals need to figure out what it's going to take to get this offense from being in the middle of the pack or near the bottom in a lot of key categories to being that top 5 offense that a lot of people think it can be when you talk about guys like Mixon, Burrow, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins. There's a lot of resources and playmakers on this offense. And so that's why the expectations are so high. And Mixon's got those high expectations for himself. And now it's just a matter of time and seeing, is Mixon right? Is there reason to be optimistic? Are those rushing yards around the corner? Or do we think that this might be the sign of some decline for Mixon? And what does that mean for the Bengals offense? But whatever the case, it's going to be fascinating to watch as the Bengals continue and try to defend that 2021 AFC title.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming sports and premium content, subscribe to ESPN+.